Hey folks, Steve here with a special video for you today. This video is some commentary around Grand Strategic World War II games. The recent unboxing of Axis Empires has gotten a lot of visibility. That's really great. I think folks have enjoyed that video, and it is of use to a great many people who are interested in the latest version of that game. That's really good stuff. Of course, that has sparked a variety of conversations, both with friends within my World in Flames circle, um, and really just spawning thoughts in my own brain about, well, what's the use case here for Axis Empires in my mind, and what to expect from it, what not to expect from it, because I've not yet really played it to a degree that I feel I can definitively say how I feel about it, but I've been reading the rules, I've been looking things over, and it's certainly sparking some thoughts. And so, I definitely didn't want to interrupt the unboxing video by hitting too many points on this thread, because I think the unboxing video for Axis Empires really deserves to be for Axis Empires to help folks there, and my additional commentary um, should be in this video, or carry-on thoughts in here. So in this video, we're going to be talking about Axis Empires. We're going to be talking about A World at War. We're going to be talking about World in Flames, and I'm going to make mention of a game called Cataclysm from GMT that it is also a grand strategic World War II game that I don't think should be compared to the other three, but it matters for some of the things that I'm going to intend to talk about here. The whole point of this video is kind of talk through what grand strategic World War II games are aiming to do, and why maybe I prefer the one that I do prefer, generally speaking, and how that affects the way I see other games, and maybe this will spark some interesting thoughts from you, the viewer, or elsewhere. And we're going to be using terms like abstraction, and kind of really look at what do we think that means in a grand strategic World War II game context, and all of that stuff. All of this is my commentary, my opinion. You don't have to agree with it. I don't expect it to be hitting people's ears as an objective truth kind of thing. This is just kind of my interpretation of what's in front of me. I do know somebody had mentioned in the unboxing video that I was maybe overly harsh in reference to A World at War. And I'm going to be honest, if I speak up on A World at War in this video and it feels like I'm throwing some punches, I do firmly believe that that game deserves those punches. So if you disagree, that's okay. We can disagree about those things. That's the keep it civil comment there. So the thing with grand strategic World War II games, and there have been a number over the years. There are many even that I'm not talking directly to in this video, that all try to do different things. And sometimes you simply have to look at a game and say, it's doing something that either I don't have the care for, it's not for me, or maybe it is just legitimately not a good game. That there's a lot of different ways you could try to argue that. But I think I said in my unboxing video that Axis Empires does things very differently than, say, World in Flames, to a degree that I think it's a distinct experience, that I can't expect Axis Empires to do the things that I really like about World in Flames, because World in Flames attempts to do something very, very different. So the part of the reason why I'm even bringing this up, there's a really good conversation I was having with my World in Flames group buddies, around our cadence of playing World in Flames, and one of our peers in the group really likes Krieg, at least, and wants to be playing Axis Empires at some point. And the new edition is certainly of interest to him, and the desire to play that. And I mean, I like the idea of getting to play this at some point opposed, with a group of people who are equally interested in it. Of course, that doesn't necessarily coincide with the pre-existing World in Flames cadence, but our World in Flames peer who likes Krieg pointed out that there's certain aspects of Axis Empires that makes it a bit more playable, in that the rule book of World in Flames can be kind of tough. It can be a slog. It's its own kind of monster experience where, and this is actually one of the design intents of Axis Empires in general, it is to be playable. Like it's a very playable game. And I think that gets into the like what are you actually after when it comes to a grand strategic World War II game? And I think playable is a totally valid thing to be pursuing. And I will admit that World in Flames, when you're playing with all the bells and whistles, which is how we play it, it can be a lot. It can be a lot to set up. There's a lot of overhead in preparing the setup for the game, and to do each turn uses a lot of mental energy because you're executing on a lot of different things. And I think there gets to a point where it can be so exhausting that it's hard to want to keep hitting it. And our group has been in a situation where we've repeatedly played 39 through like 41 or 42, and inevitably somebody gets demoralized and we restart, and it kind of to me is hard to replay those first few years of the campaign all the time, and that feels like what we're doing all the time. Um, where that can get tough, and there is so much going on. There's a lot of room to make some tough mistakes as you're learning to play World in Flames, where maybe in a game like Axis Empires you maybe have a different level of bandwidth to learn, adapt, and play the game. Now, um, there is a particular thing when you look at a grand strategic World War II game that if it's grand strategic, it really does need to have strategic elements to that. And while I'm sure the people who are watching this video, you have some pretty good understanding of like tactical versus operational versus strategic and grand strategic. Um, it is something to look at for any design, that is saying it's a grand strategic game, to say, well, to what degree is it strategic, and what are the boundaries of the strategy that can actually be played out, and at what point do you run out of options to actually pursue strategic consequences? And to me, that's a really key element. If you're playing a game that doesn't have very many strategic decisions and consequences, you might just be playing a game that is functionally a grand operational game where everything that you're doing is really a series of operational campaigns, zoomed out to a degree at a scale that feels, you know, overall strategic for a theater of operations. Um, the strategic element starts to play in where you're able to make political decisions, or the consequences of a campaign have truly strategic implications, and that's something that I'm gonna really focus in on here for a second with the Axis Empires map in Vassal brought up to talk to. Now I will say that what is up here is the latest version of the Vassal module for Totaler Krieg and Dicenso. I think it's been updated somewhat since the last release of those games, but this may not reflect um, the exact map status of the Ultimate Edition. So if there are some differences, that we're going to have to deal with that until the new Vassal module is released. But I think generally what I'm going to talk about here is true even in the Ultimate Edition. So one of the things that like Axis Empires and A World at War do is, and some of this has to do with how the games were developed and their sort of ancestry, the history of the game series that they belong to, really puts World War II in a framework of two theater of operations: the European theater of operations and the Asia Pacific theater of operations. The Pacific theater of operations, PTO, tends to be the way it gets referenced, right? And that's not that's relatively straightforward. And what Axis Empires and the World at War both do is they lay out, this is where you're going to be fighting. It should be, about what you would expect for, say, Europe, and likewise for Asia Pacific. And then wherever the map ends, you do get this sort of end of the world, block. Like the world stops at these hexes. And I'm going to zoom into Egypt because I think Egypt is going to illustrate my point here very well, that Like any strategic European theater of operations game, there will be fighting in Egypt. And from an Axis perspective, there are carrots and sticks around any particular area on the map that, is there a reason to go there and to succeed? Well, certainly not just because you want to be fighting the Allies anyway, but as the Axis, you can be trying to push into Egypt. Cairo is a strategic hex, which means that it is important for victory point determination and victory. And obviously, having sealed up Egypt makes it easier to not have to worry about the Allies pushing from the east to get into, say, Italy and that sort of thing. So there's a very general incentive for the Axis to get Cairo. If they do, then the question is, well, what's the strategic implications of that? Well, in Axis empires, and generally in a world at war, I would say, you kind of get to this point where you can take Egypt, and then it's really a question of, are you needing to go into Palestine, Syria, and Iraq? You can see that Baghdad is listed here or shown here as a strategic hex. So if the Axis is doing very well and they've taken Cairo, they can start to look at a push to Baghdad. They can start to move up further north. Whether or not Persia is in play, maybe this is beyond wildest expectations for the Axis to get out to Baghdad. But the game map really stops at this border of hexes here. Like, the game world ends. There are these boxes. There's two. There's the East Africa box. There's the Middle East box down here near Egypt. And these are boxes that only the Allies can utilize. You can see that they have some game effects here that allow you to move units and do different things. It's a replacement location to put Australians, Indians, and New Zealanders into play. And so if the Axis has totally overrun Egypt, maybe pushing into Iraq, they are basically stuck. Like, you can see here that they can't move past this hex set. There's nowhere to go here. And the same thing you can go over to Kuwait, which may have some value to get there. But the world ends, right? So what are the strategic implications of pushing hard in North Africa? Well, in game terms, it's broadly speaking to get the strategic hexes. And is that enough of a carrot? Well, sure. It is how victory is determined. But the strategic implications may be somewhat limited. So certainly, creating a breach of how the Eastern Med can connect to the Arabian Sea, that's maybe a concern there, certainly. But there's sort of a limit there, right? Like, there is a place where what you can do if you've done very well down here, it reaches to an extent. You're not allowed to push into the Middle East. You're not allowed to push into East Africa. You're simply not allowed to. And a World at War does something very similar. There are similar boxes. You as the Axis, you simply can't go. You don't have the option. So the limit of consequence strategically is here, basically, right? And it's not nothing. I don't want to diminish that, but when we compare that to World in Flames, I think there's going to be something worth showing there. Anywhere else you look on the map, there's usually, you're going to be dealing with the rest of fighting in World War II. Even worrying about somehow the Axis doing extremely well in Egypt may be simply too far outside the band of history to really appreciate, but it is something to think about, that you are boxed into what the map shows, and that's it. This is what the map shows you. It is what you're allowed to operate with within the European theater of operations, and you are restricted to that. Somewhat similar, there are similar boxes over here in the Asia-Pacific theater, but I think Egypt is just the best example of that. So, by comparison, World in Flames handles that differently, but this starts to get into a good sort of tangent to say, like, to what degree do you want your grand strategic game to be a sandbox? Now, I think Axis Empires, if not a sandbox, does open up a lot of capabilities to do ahistorical things via the Dice of Decision module. When you're actually playing the game, the cards drive your production and drive your approach to, I guess, options within a historical narrative that isn't totally off the wall. Um, you can certainly get things that are different from history. So, whether you consider that a sandbox is one thing. Um, but those edge cases, when they occur, I think are important. And I think World in Flames is going to do this a little bit differently than Axis Empires. And when you look at a World at War, there are similarities between a World at War and Axis Empires in terms of the map framing. I recall in a written review, somebody once said that a World at War was less of a sandbox than World in Flames. I disagree with that, and I disagree with it because a World at War provides an avenue for Germany to develop an A-bomb. So I think a World at War is a bit more sandboxy than World in Flames, certainly. But this is all splitting hairs. What I want to do, since I was comparing to Egypt, is I'm going to switch over to the latest module, Vassal module for World in Flames, and kind of compare what this looks like for how World in Flames handles that Egyptian situation. Okay, so here we are in the somewhat equivalent map space for World in Flames. Very different map art, very different intents. But when we zoom in here a bit and talk about Egypt, um, you can imagine that, yes, okay, let's say the Axis has done very well. In fact, this has happened in a recent World in Flames campaign that we've been playing, where the Axis can get into Egypt and can take it, right? Now, that has a direct effect to the convoys that travel between Red Sea and the Eastern Med, so something you would kind of expect. Um, but when we get to the edge of the map, and I guess this is the big thing that connects the way World in Flames approaches abstraction and simulation and trying to make a different, accounting for it. When you hit this hex, you've taken Alexandria, you've taken Cairo, maybe you've taken Port Said, Suez. You can be pushing into Syria and Iraq. You can also start to go down here and hit these other off-map locations, and where you end up, for simplicity's sake, I'm not going to trace the whole line, but you do end up over here, and you end up over here on the Pacific map, which does display Saudi Arabia, Aden, Oman, Ethiopia, Somaliland, East Africa, Tanzania, Mozambique. And it does put all of these places in context. So rather than just having strategic hexes, which in World in Flames they do exist, these red titled city hexes or location hexes are objective hexes. So fundamentally, they operate somewhat similarly, that at the end of the game, in terms of victory counting, you do care about the red titled hexes. So there is a strategic hex here, there's a strategic hex here, and other places. So yes, there is that same carrot. But the strategic consequence of losing Egypt in a World in Flames game isn't simply the end of the map. It can go much broader than that. And World in Flames bothers to represent the Italian holdings in East Africa such that if you did have the Axis taking Egypt and the Sinai, the Axis could be pushing down into Saudi Arabia, could be pushing towards this very critical port here, could be pushing down to support connectivity to Ethiopia, and opening up the door for Italian submarines to be pushing out to the Arabian Sea, further disrupting Commonwealth convoys and starting to affect, at least in some part, the way that the Pacific War is going. And you just don't get that same interactivity in Axis Empires, for instance, or World at War. I mean, you're just simply not going to get those same types of situations. Me being the poor guy that has seen it happen to the Allies more than once of Egypt being lost to the Axis. There are very broad-reaching strategic consequences for that. Um, that it makes it more meaningful to lose Egypt in a World in Flames game, in my mind, than maybe it does in an Axis Empires or a World at War. Um, Kind of saying that, a bit removed from those situations, but it is something that is clear in a World in Flames context that can happen. Um, and you can kind of look at this again. It's a way of saying, at least I think from the World in Flames point of view, like what would actually happen if that happened, right? It didn't happen historically. The Axis failed to take Egypt, but if it did, well, what are the consequences of that? What can start to happen if that occurred? And there are many different repercussions towards it. You could try to argue that that is more simulationist than an abstraction. Understanding that all war games are abstractions, you're basically just trying to pick what's the level of abstraction that you feel is acceptable. So if somebody says, I'm okay with Axis empires not having that level of fidelity to go to that extent to show what could be much broader reaching repercussions for the Axis to do that. I think that's valid, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Axis Empires or World at War is worse for not being able to show that, but in terms of a meaningful, grand strategic choice and consequence, or consequence of failure maybe to perform well, those games are abstracting a lot of that out and are basically leaving it to just victory points. And at the end of the day, that does support the more focused, playable view of those game types, Axis Empires and a World at War as it compares. One of the other big things that you see with World in Flames is very much more what you see is what you get, meaning that I'm going to switch a view over to France for a second. There are very real, tangible effects to France losing Lille, losing these resource hexes that represent various natural resource and mining operations, and things like that in France at the time. That the map is littered with these resource hexes and factory hexes, and puts a very real consequence on losing a heavily industrial region of a country that is at war. So if you take Lille, you are de facto knocking down French production, or affecting their ability to produce arms, to produce equipment, amongst other game effects, where in an Axis Empires, by comparison, that game takes the production process off the map entirely. There really is not that dramatic of an effect of you losing certain parts of a country, so long as you're playing your options cards, and so as long as that card is telling you that you get a certain number of replacement points or reinforcements or what have you. The game state of the map is nearly totally disconnected from the production. And I think that's going to be one thing I'm going to have trouble with in Axis Empires. I'm just going to look at that and go, okay, we've abstracted things to such a degree that territory on the map is almost incidental, in some ways, versus just like you want to get all their cities, you want to shut them down, you want to conquer the minor country or achieve the Vichy condition for France or any other country for that matter. But that you're just totally taking that element out of it. And that seems really weird to me, because World in Flames, and at least in terms of the way it's designed, or my interpretation of its design, is very much you do something because it does have a consequence. It has a impact in the way that the simulation connects things together, and some of this is also related to optional rules, but like the oil hexes are important. So if you're playing with oil, and that is optional, but for the sake of my argument here, I'll say like World in Flames, when you're playing with oil matters. How you spend this constrained resource matters, and your ability to get more oil does affect your ability to operate and produce things and operate with them. So the question of getting Romanian oil is important. The attempt to get into uh, Baku here for the 4 oil is actually like has very meaningful impacts to the game um, as the Axis, but beyond being a strategic, in Axis Empires a strategic hex here, there's a strategic implication of getting an extra 4 oil per turn for the Axis that has a very real game impact that relates directly to the units on the map and your ability to operate on the map. So it's certainly less abstracted than the Axis Empires version of it. Um, so that actually matter. Like you care about your oil expenditures. If you're not playing with oil, those are still resources that can still be used in Germany to produce units, and so there's still a reason to push for it. Besides just a strategic hex that may count for victory points, in World in Flames there's a very tangible reason to go get more oil, and that's a consideration throughout the game of are you overspending oil? Are you being thoughtful on the resources that your faction has? In Axis Empires, there is almost no consideration for oil. Um, there is an oil embargo uh, bit for Dicenso, but if you were to control F and look for the word oil in the Totalerkrieg stuff, there really isn't any whatsoever. So the impacts of resource oil, you know, getting oil, spending oil, even being considerate around the usage of oil is simply not a factor at all. It's abstracted out. So like production, these things that in my mind have a very real implication to the grand strategy, the strategy consequences of World War II, and how you operate, become abstracted. Now, in exchange for that abstraction, Axis Empires gives you a different level of fidelity on making these very packaged options with the cards. So I think for here I'm going to switch back over to the Axis Empires vassal module. With the Axis Empires stuff back up again, I just want to show, again, looking at Baku, it's a strategic hex, but there are not real oil markers or anything, any resources on the map. There are cities, there are hexes that are, marked to be important, but they don't have the same level of effect that you might think. There are a couple of things that are baked into at-large seasonal reinforcements that, depending on how well the Axis is doing, they can get a few extra steps, but a very different model. What you're getting, though, when you are, if you see abstraction as an issue, or we say we're going to have more abstraction, but with that abstraction, we're going to be able to get things like these cards, which are very packaged deal decisions, both from a production standpoint and then also a political element. So no matter which one you're looking at here, you say, okay, we're going to demand the Polish corridor. That's going to give us some panzer build stuff. We're going to get some infantry steps. We're going to have an effect politically that are going to matter. And that does make it easier for a player to say, like, well, what can I do? What should I do? Well, here's a pre-packaged option for me to take that's going to send me down one path or another. And I do think there's utility in that. Like, there is goodness in that, because in a game like World in Flames where you have just so much going on, it can be difficult to know what you should be doing at any point and where you're going to have some long-term consequences for not doing something that you should have done. In the Axis Empires context, it's much easier to say, okay, well, I've got to pick a card. I kind of need to decide, am I going to support nationalists, or am I going to demand Switzerland, or I think there's a couple of like very specific choices between, okay, like, are we going to pick Operation Sea Lion, or are we going to play uh, Barbarossa, right? That's a very distinct choice. That's a choice that you make in World in Flames, right? You usually have to decide: are you going to try for a Sea Lion, or are you going to try for a Barbarossa? And if you're going to go Sea Lion in World in Flames, you really need to get your plan figured out on how you're going to do that. Like, you have to be very committed and build certain things and prepare certain things and know exactly what you're going to do to execute that, which is a lot tougher. And maybe in my mind there's satisfaction in doing that. It's more effort, but I get more out of the thought process of trying to prepare that. Where in an Axis Empires context, you're making a decision here, right? And then based off that decision, if you're going to do Sea Lion instead of Barbarossa, what you're going to get instead, if we look at this, you say, well, there's add to force pool. There's a HQ. You get the HQ either way. You get a Panzer unit, but in Barbarossa, you're going to get an additional, a different set of HQ and infantry. You're going to get, looks like less Panzers, but more air units and more subs. And then depending if you're playing with the expansion, that may actually be the more discrete units in Schiffskrieg. And so you just sort of get a different prioritized build, right? Different things in the force pool, different things in the delay box, different focus bits to determine what are you going to get and when. Maybe there's not a huge difference, but those decisions are made for you, and you kind of get that. You just get stuff. You aren't sitting there thinking, okay, I'm going to get several U-boats, I'm going to get a lot of naval air, I'm going to get my amphs built, my transports built. Maybe as Germany, I'm building a lot more convoy points or something. I don't think you'd necessarily do that, but those are things you are thinking about in World in Flames, where by comparison, it's kind of laying out, you're going to take this and then you're going to use this to try to execute Operation Sea Lion. So I think there's goodness there, right? It's not one's better than the other. You're exchanging something. You're exchanging the what is, in my mind, greater fidelity, greater maybe complexity, certainly, to get a more filling experience. And maybe to me that's the great reason as to why I am glad I have Axis Empires, because World in Flames is a mammoth undertaking to set up, to get all the force pools set up, to be arranged to play World in Flames, is a lot of effort. When I am done at a World in Flames session, depending on how well it went for me, I'm somewhere in some mixture of exhaustion and exultation of what we got done and what we did and what decisions did I make and where are we at and the things that I'm thinking about and the per hex consideration of how I'm going to launch this operation, this attack, start this campaign. But it's so much effort that gets poured into that, where I get the feeling like for Axis Empires, it'll be, no matter what scenario I'm playing, will be a lot easier to set up, period, and will thus be less overhead to set up, play, enjoy, put back in the box, and put on the shelf. When I want to do something like that and have these pre-packaged options in the cards to just kind of play through. And I'm exchanging the full-bodied, full meal deal experience that World in Flames can provide. That's going to take a lot more effort, and I can't always sustain that when I'm going to play a game. And that's why I greatly enjoy having a regular World in Flames group that I can play with on a somewhat regular basis and get that experience. And, Axis Empires can be something, supplemental that I can bust out and play and enjoy in a much shorter time frame, even if this game can still take 100 hours. Even if the total time played might be the same as World in Flames, I'm exchanging one aspect of that experience for a different aspect. And yeah, you toss in dice of decision, there ends up being a lot more enjoyable things that are a lot harder to replicate in World in Flames. That, again, makes Axis Empires a unique experience. So in all this conversation, my intent here is not to beat up on Axis Empires, but to call out, like why I wouldn't give up World in Flames for Axis Empires as my primary grand strategic World War II game. It's just that it just there are things that World in Flames does that no other game has been able to do or do in a way that I think is well executed, that just makes it too hard to give up. But there's plenty of goodness here. Um, Truly, I think my big gripe is the disconnect of the map state to production. The exception being, like, if you've taken every city and a country has no reinforcement locations, then they kind of lose their ability to produce because they can't put replacement steps. So there is an element of it, but like taking northeastern France has no real impact to the way France is putting units on the board, and they can always be plopping things in Paris. They can always be plopping things in Nantes, or Bordeaux or Toulouse, and so on. And so that's just a hard thing for me. The ends of the earth, in Egypt, happening. I can give up the more fidelity of World in Flames in terms of the playability of just, okay, I've managed to do well here. I'm reaping some benefit for that in a game sense, and I have to be okay with that and give up some of these things. And even looking at it from a Pacific Theater bit, right? The same sorts of things apply here. Maybe less end of the worldness, but I do have to wonder, like, well, what does it look like for Japan to be trying to get into India? What are the considerations there that, again, matter a whole lot in a World in Flames context, maybe matter differently in Axis Empires, and you just have to accept certain bits of that. The other thing that I did want to mention in making these sort of comparisons, and I could make the same comparison for a World at War, where I think a World at War and Axis Empires kind of sit in maybe one edge of this whole abstraction and playability. Maybe it's a triangle, right? Sorry guys, I'm gonna throw a punch at a World at War for a second. I think World in Flames is on one end of a spectrum that is maybe not as quote unquote playable because there's a lot of effort involved in playing World in Flames, but you get a lot more of that fidelity. Simulation maybe is a strong word, but you get a lot more of the resources to constraints to strategic consequences being fleshed out, and that's one end of that triangle spectrum. Then the other end is Axis Empires, which is much lower maybe on some of those strategic consequences, um, in a global sense, and I'm going to hit that global word here in another minute. But it's very playable. And then maybe, and I'm sorry guys, like a World at War, maybe it's playable after you've really sussed out how the game is supposed to play. But getting through that rule book and getting the dots to connect appropriately is just, somehow they've made it much harder than it needs to be. Is like maybe it's lower on that fidelity scale, and then it's just not as playable in my opinion. That, again, all my opinions, guys. Sorry. Um, but I think something that Axis Empires and a World at War have in common is that the strategy is very specific to two buckets. You have European strategy and you have Pacific strategy. And those are the two specific pillars upon which both Axis Empires and a World at War stand on. Some of that because a World at War grew out of Advanced Third Reich and Empire of the Rising Sun, I believe was the name of the game. That became a World at War, and Axis Empires has grown out of Krieg, Totaler Krieg, and Die Senso, which are very specific boxed games that are meant to cover a very specific theater of operation. And World in Flames has, since I believe it's even its first version, has always been both games in a box, and specifically, I think, at least the more recent editions and recent versions of World in Flames, I would describe as a global World War II game. And maybe that's a distinction, and that's a distinction that many games don't make. Even Cataclysm. So I would mention Cataclysm here. I think Cataclysm's also in a very like it's playable, it's heavily abstracted, and you're not getting as much fidelity. But I think Cataclysm does a really good job of being a like 10 to 12 hour global campaign game that works good enough for what it aims to do. I quite like Cataclysm a lot, actually. I really, really like it. It is very different from World in Flames and even Axis Empires, but it does abstraction in a very good way. Where I think the abstractions that it does for playability and what you get out of the game hits a really good balance, and it ends up being really fun for the shorter amount of time you're playing that game. Um, Even it is really Europe and Pacific, boxed, where World in Flames does have a way to represent the different countries of Africa, and there are important reasons as to why it's set up that way. That you can go to Nigeria, you can go to these places. There is a meaningful reason to um, have those C zones represented and those hexes represented. That every part of the globe is represented in World in Flames in some way, even if it may seem superfluous to do so. It gives you a lot more fidelity. Where, I mean, you don't you see this stuff represented very differently in a World at War. A World at War does make an attempt to show this in the strategic warfare boxes of that game, where you sure can try to raid the Atlantic and be raiding near the United States. And I've had German auxiliary cruisers in World in Flames shooting up convoys in a part of the world where uh, that part of the map just isn't represented at all. So I think when I look at it, I go, World in Flames may be a cut above the rest in that it truly attempts to be a global World War II, a global war simulation of World War II, where Axis Empires, A World at War, um, ironic given A World at War's name, is very much constrained to a Europe theater of operations, a Pacific theater of operations, and the rest of the world kind of doesn't exist or is so abstracted as to become non-relevant. So all that to say, right, it doesn't make any of these games worse or better than the others. I'll be generous to A World at War and say, if you really like A World at War and you like what it does, that is great for you and that it is a worthwhile experience for folks. I will not deny that. Um, all these games have different things that they focus on, and I can see where putting World in Flames in front of somebody, particularly the deluxe edition, can be too much. It is exhausting. It is, sometimes you might just want to play through a war in Europe that is not does not have all that overhead hanging above. And I think Axis Empires has made a shift in the Ultimate Edition with the Schiffskrieg module to give you something that is a little more with a higher level of fidelity. The fact that in the base game of Axis Empires, your Luftwaffe, as the Germans, can be anywhere on the map, wherever you decide to deploy it, feels very disconnected from real decision making, right? You're just saying now the Luftwaffe is going to operate here, and it's very abstracted to the point of just being, um, I don't know. It's like you're not really even commanding an air force, right? You're basically just saying I'm going to get bonuses here this time because I'm using this marker here, and that doesn't feel very simulationist. Where the Schiffskrieg expansion that comes in the Ultimate Edition actually has you having to think about the basing of land-based air, the basing of your ships, and then the actual support markers are instead considered to be like the more ephemeral decision-making willpower to execute an operation with those resources, and that is going to feel a lot more like the way I think it probably should feel in where like in A World at War or World in Flames, you do have to think about where are my planes based, where are my finite number of planes. Well, where have I divided them up on the map? Where are they actually operating? I have to think through that. I have to think about the basing operations. It's sort of like with if you think about what's an attempt to capture Gibraltar look like in Axis Empires, well, in World in Flames, at least, I have to be thinking about, if I'm Italy and Germany, I have to be thinking about who controls Morocco and Algeria. Is it Vichy? Have we collapsed Vichy? Why does that matter? Or who controls Spain? Why does that matter? Because I need these equivalent World in Flames hexes to be basing for my air power to be restricting British supplies in the North Atlantic over here, right? Like there's a very tangible thing that I need to go execute in very real terms of real resources being applied in a logically distinct place to achieve a logically discrete outcome, where that decision making in Axis empires would be very different without Schiffskrieg, and I am interested to see where does Schiffskrieg apply here, right? If I can only do an air campaign with very discrete resources, now I have to think about where they're based. Where can I get to Gibraltar? How does Gibraltar trace supply? Is there a way for me to affect Gibraltar's supply situation? Those are the types of things I need to discover in Axis Empires, and if you're an expert in the system and you can describe to me how that equivalent works, I would be very interested to see. And that's a big part of this, right? I guess I want to wrap up this video with a general sentiment that whether you're a Pepsi guy or a Coke guy, or Mr. Pibb or whatever, whatever game you like, ultimately each game is going to handle things differently, and the right game for you is going to depend so much on what you want and need out of a strategic World War II game. I think World in Flames hits everything that I really, really want, but I can't always get what I want, right? I can't always lean into World in Flames, even at home in a solitaire context, because it is so exhausting. Under the right circumstances, I'm going to get a full meal deal that is going to be very fulfilling, very filling in my gamer's stomach, and hit all these amazing things that no other game can get. That doesn't mean that a World at War or an Axis Empires doesn't have some level of value, and in particular, Axis Empires is going to fit a very different niche for me in a grand strategic World War II game. That is playability a factor here? Yes. The fact that it is more quote-unquote playable does make it easier to figure out how I'm going to get it to the table and play it. And I'm not going to be as stressed on all the minutia of all the decisions that World in Flames is going to put in front of me. And what that really means is that while Axis Empires may not be as filling, it is something that I'm going to be able to consume more easily. And at the end of the day, folks may interpret that as a knock against Axis Empires, but I don't mean it to be that way. And maybe I'm going to maybe I'm hungry. I don't know. I'm going to make another food analogy. If World in Flames is the, exquisite, steak dinner that takes a lot of time, you want to cook the meat right, you got to season, you're doing a marinade, you're putting a lot of work into crafting the right flavorful steak with some really well prepared sides that took some effort to put in, and there's some fancy dessert that you've made. A lot of work into getting a very more a lot of work for a very specific experience in that meal. Axis Empires is going to be a very well crafted steak burger or something. And again, someone's going to say Steve's calling Axis Empires a cheeseburger, but I think it's if you make a really damn good burger, I don't mean the kind you just get at a fast food restaurant, but like you did take the time and effort to craft a really well made burger at home. There's bordering on like artisanal burger. Just really putting the works on making that a delicious burger. You probably didn't have maybe you didn't have to put in as much work maybe to get that burger going. You got some frozen patties from Costco, but you've got the condiments you like, and you got some tomatoes you sliced, and you did the whole thing. Maybe it doesn't take as much work as the other meal, but it's still going to be good. You're still going to enjoy it. You're still going to say, I want to eat that again. And to me, that maybe is the distinction here. And uh, at the end of the day, if you're going to play one game, you have to make that decision. World in Flames is my desert island game. Axis Empires is a game I'm going to be very happy to play and enjoy, and I'm okay with that. Now, everyone's going to have their favorite World War II strategic game of choice, and there's going to be folks out there that just say that level of effort you need to go make that meal for World in Flames just isn't, that juice isn't worth the squeeze, and I get that. I do not expect people to uh, go play World in Flames all the time. I don't assume that that's going to be reasonable for a great many people, and that's why I think this Axis Empires package from Decision is such a cool thing, because it does look like. I mean, I poured over the rule books. I found like one minor grammatical typo that is I wouldn't even consider it errata. It's just like, oh yeah, they included the word the one extra time where they didn't need to in a heading. I haven't run across any real errata yet. I'm pouring over rule books and stuff. The components are just out of this world good. Um, if you don't think you can handle World in Flames, I do get the feeling like Axis Empires is going to be a really good, compromise of you want to play a World War II, both, European and Pacific theater deal that's going to be enjoyable with Schiffskrieg if you need more detail and you're just unwilling to go to the full, effort required for a World in Flames. I think a lot of people are going to be very happy with this package. I do get that sense. And the thing for some people, and it's going to be the same for me, is you have to deal with the divorce of map state to production and the end of the world stuff. As I'm talking through this, and maybe this video is more to help organize my own thoughts than anything, is those are the two things that are always going to rub me in a way that will keep me from saying Axis Empires will be better than WIF. Besides any other number of elements, is going to be, hey, it's the end of the world at that map edge, and you can't go into those boxes. That's for allies only. No matter what you do, no matter how good the game position is for you, you can't do it. And production is just this very off-map thing. That production is divorced from the reality of the map. That those will always be the sticking points for me. I don't think that would make Axis Empires a bad game at all, and I don't think it's the deal breaker to play it, and I don't think that should necessarily be a deal breaker for anybody else. But again, that's just my opinion. So anyway, just some commentary here, guys. I hope this rambling was at least interesting. Being able to compare the two games here, like I am, maybe is of some value. I do think there's maybe a good case for a more detailed, structured, organized video to try to compare these things, but I don't know how much good that does. I think it's important for somebody to look into these games and make a decision for yourself on what level of fidelity matters to you, what level of abstraction matters to you. The sandbox thing, I don't know that any of these games are much more sandboxy than the others, besides the fact that you can go crazy ahistorical with the dice of decision, and that's a very specific feature of that module. All these things have a place. So anyway, I got to wrap this thing up. I've been talking a while. Hope this video was at least somewhat interesting. I'm looking forward to some level of discourse in the comments section down below. Let me know what you think. If you really love a world at war, that's cool. I do not, but I still wonder if maybe I've not given it its 20th chance to impress me. So we'll see. Anyway, folks, thanks for watching. We'll see you in future videos. Let me know what you think down below, and have a good evening.